So a couple of things about Storymaps to start. As I said, it's from this company, Esri. And the idea of story maps are not exclusive to Esri. They didn't invent the idea of story maps. There's even an open source story map option from a group at a university called Night Labs. And you might have even heard of the term story maps before you heard about it from Esri. But it's for anybody who's used any sort of GIS in the past, when you use story maps, you think, oh, that's a refreshing take on things. It seems like it was made for people who have an interest in sharing information, but don't feel like they need to have, a degree in maps in order to use it. And it turns out the Storymaps was created by a completely separate, very specific team at Esri that was started and is still led by a person, Alan Carroll, who used to be a cartographer at National Geographic for, I think, a couple of decades. So he brought this sensibility in. And the idea is, you can say right here, their little tagline, which they spend a lot of time thinking about if it's on the front page: create inspiring immersive stories by combining text, interactive maps, and other multimedia content. Publish and share your story or organization with everyone around the world. And just so you notice, and this is, I almost hesitate to point it out, but I still do. Storymaps is all one word. There was a previous version of Storymaps, which are still out there, that were replaced by these a couple of years ago. The old version had a space between the words. The new version doesn't. But when you spell Storymaps, this is the way. It's ArcGIS Storymaps means this newer version. So part of the idea was at least give you a clue about what Storymaps looked like, just so you can start to get your head around it. But even before I got there, I just wanted to express, and we did it at the end and at the last workshop, and we mentioned it a little bit at the beginning to people who are here early, is that there's a lot of information and there's lots of possibilities when you think about how you can use some technologies in the classroom. And often I've seen people in a lot of our workshops, and Judy and Rebecca can probably speak to this too, and you probably reflect on your own, that you get something new, you see that it's really, there's a lot of possibilities. And sometimes you get so wrapped up in, what are all of the things that I can do with this? Or what's the maximum way that I can use it? Sometimes you lose sight of the fact that trying to use it at all can be a win in the beginning. So one of the things I just wanted to mention is how, what level could you use story maps at? One thing is that you could just find a story map that already exists that has the information that's useful to you. So you might have to do nothing other than identify, wow, I'm really interested in this topic. Oh, somebody built a story map on this topic already. I'm going to use that story map and sort of build my curriculum around that thing that already exists. You yourself could take it, just get a login, be able to create a story map that's very specific to what you want to share. And then you could use that in your class. Your students don't really have to know anything about the background. They don't need to have accounts. They just need to go on a web browser to a website that you've created as a story map and use it for the lesson. Of course, then you could also have students create their own story maps if you had accounts for them. And we can talk more about that at the end. But I will say, there's a lot of discussion in the last workshop about how do we get accounts, and can all our students have accounts, and how does that work? Which I think is important, but it also misses the fact that sometimes, especially in the beginning, just finding a story map that works for you or creating one on your own and having the class use it could be a great way to get involved without even worrying about, do all students have accounts? And I would even say, in the end, sometimes if you work in projects or teams, right? It doesn't even necessarily be that every single student needs an account. Maybe even 5 accounts could be enough for a classroom, depending on what it is that you're doing. So I just wanted to put that out there before we looked at possibilities. I think there's lots of different ways you could use it, some of which could require a lot of technology and a lot of thinking about how to get students their own accounts. And otherwise, it might just be finding something that already exists, or even just getting an account for you and having you experiment and make something first. So does Judy or Rebecca just want to say anything at all or about that? Or I feel like that was missing in the beginning of the last one.
That's perfect.
Okay, good. So just a couple examples of what StoryMaps look like. If you go to the StoryMaps website and you click on resources, they do a pretty good job of really trying to display and start you down paths of getting the information that you need. If you click on gallery, it shows you a whole bunch of different types of story maps, and they used to be able to submit yours to be included here. They don't do that anymore. Now they choose the ones without anybody's input, but you can also, they featured 172 here. And as you scroll along, you might even go here and see, oh, well, what for the birds? I'm interested in birds. There's a land bird monitoring survey, or here's how this is one that NOAA used to look at oil spill assessments for marine mammals. And just a couple of things about story maps. The idea, the way that they work, is it's supposed to be that the content's presented in a scrolling manner. So as you scroll down the story map, you get to areas where there's different sorts of content. So in this case, you start out with a bit of text. You just scroll down, there's a map. This map is an interactive map. So this was a map that was created either in an Arcgis Online account or even within a story map. And so it allows you to have different types of format. You could have images, links, you can change the text. Is it big, small? Is it this quote? There's even sections where you can have video that's playing or playable in it. So it really is structured that as you scroll down, you move through this story so that you can control the way in which the information is presented to people. So on Esri's website, if you go to Story Maps, again, click on resources and then gallery, you'll get to a whole bunch of different examples. And I mean, over the past few years, I've spent a lot of time making maps and sharing maps where I mostly just used to teach other people. So in response to COVID-19, story maps and even some other Esri products have been used extensively to try to share information about resources and also disease progression. So a couple of just other examples that I'm familiar with. One is a story that I worked on, a story map with a professor at UNH. This, I think, was published officially, it was late last year. And she has this project, the Great Bay Archaeological Survey, and she's worked on for many years, looking at what's going on, all of these digs in the area around the Great Bay in New Hampshire. And it's an interesting story because she worked with a lot of volunteers as part of this. And she does conference presentations, journal articles, books, even a book. But she wanted to see, is there another way I can present that information that's maybe a little more compelling and engaging and might find more people? So this one, as you scroll down, one thing you'll notice is that you can have a series of bookmarks here at the top, which I find pretty useful because let's say we really cared about what you have found. You don't want to necessarily have to make people scroll forever to get down, and also tracks sort of people's locations throughout. But I'm showing you just this, just so you can see a few of the different formats. So again, you can have text and images. They also have this nice image grid where you take a bunch of images and you give it to the story map and it creates this nice little grid. So you can imagine that you could have 3 images on top of each other, or let it make this grid. And then on each of the images that you click, it lets you see the full image. See, there's also audio clips, which is cool. So you can hear people's own words. I don't know if you'll be able to hear it.
From the Great Bay Estuary.
You can link out to their websites. As I said, you can pull out things as quotes. So this was used in the other one as well. This is these elements that they have. And this one's called sidebar or sidecar, sorry. And this looks very much like one of the previous story maps. And one of the things about story maps that's interesting too is you can create something called an express map. So I wanted to make a map of just showing the different 7 major rivers that flowed into Great Bay. And even though I know a lot of GIS, I still thought it was easier to use this thing called an express map, which they designed for people to make maps who know nothing about GIS. It was actually, they went out of their way in this new version to say, if you don't know anything about GIS, that's fine. We still want to give you a way to make a map without having to learn a whole bunch about the technology behind the scenes. One of the things they added just in time for me was this element called the timeline. She wanted to look at the progression of different folks that were coming in and out of the area, and I kept struggling to figure out a way to do it. And all of a sudden, Esri introduced a timeline element that structures it so that you can have different dates and then have the ability to scroll down throughout. This doesn't have to be a date. It could be a recipe. It could be a person's name. I mean, it can be a type of wildlife that you're looking for, the little summary of what that animal is. It's just a different sort of design choice. This is largely the same, so I'll skip by. They also have this slideshow. So this is showing the different ways in which the archaeological work was done. So there's a series of images with a little blurb of text, which again stops you from scrolling, and gives you a different way to interact and present information. You can also put swipe tools, and this one didn't come out exactly the way somebody else did this, but the idea is they're trying to show a previous map on top of an old map. You can also do that with images. So it can be a map on each side of that, or an image, like you could take a before or after, or you could take a winter or summer shot of the same area and easily create this little swipe tool. And there's another type of map as well, which this in and of itself used to be a different type of story map, but now you can plop this in. And this map was chosen to show all of the different locations that fragments of pottery came from that were all found in Great Bay. So this marker here is where Great Bay is, and here are all of the different locations. So you can zoom in and around this map and click on these individual points and then see the pottery fragments that were shown there. You can also scroll down through this and it moves to the different locations that each of those elements were found at. So this too, if you know GIS, there's a fancier way to do this, but if you have no idea what GIS is, you can just build this right in the StoryMap interface. So I think that's about all of the different types of content, but at least this gives you an idea. And here's just another image gallery with a bunch of images that they had of different items that were found in their archaeological work. So there's lots of different potential ways that you can take information and show it. And you can see this one has some maps, but is not that map heavy. You could also make a story map that has no maps in it. And you might say, well, why bother to make a story map that has no maps? Well, it could be that the way that StoryMaps lets you create and build and share the information is a pretty compelling way to do it, even if you have 0 maps and it's just all images and videos and text. I'll also say that these are responsive. So as you show them on different size screens, they will flex. So this would be probably, I don't know, more or less maybe a tablet or a Chromebook. It does crunch things down fairly well. I mean, each thing will look slightly different, but it does reconfigure things. If you were going to look at it on a mobile phone, it also does crunch things down. You can even see it handles this differently. Instead of having these elements on the side, it sort of tucks them up on the top of the screen. So these were built knowing that a lot of people were going to use them on devices that were not just big, giant computer screens. So that is something that's built in to the way that story maps work. And I guess the final thing about this that I'll say is that sometimes you learn about technologies and you get really excited. You want to go run and use them. You have the next day you have a way to use them. And often you get exposed to things and you say, well, I don't have time, or I don't know, this is going to be extra. It's going to be an extra thing I have to do on top of what I'm already doing. I don't have the time, or I can't do it. But maybe knowing you could and getting ideas maybe becomes the way that you do something in the future. And I will say, Rebecca and I were chuckling about this many times. We've both largely been unsuccessful at getting our own children to actually make a story map. They love mapping. They know what. One of my sons wants to always bring the refreshments to the workshops back when I taught them in person, but we never got one of them to do something. Although my 7th grade son, at the end of last year, made a choice that he was going to make a story map for a project at school. And the school project was a genius hour that was in English, actually, an English language arts class. And she gave them a challenge, come up with an idea that you want to explore. And she gave them almost carte blanche to do what they wanted to do. And he said, I want to make a map of plants and animals in Stratham, New Hampshire. That is what I want to do for my project. Dad, let's make a story map. So I was very excited, but also very cautious that I did not want to do the story map for him. This is not the point. So I acted as the teacher and led him through thinking about the story map. And I will say that's one of the parts of all of this. If you're going to make one of these, you really want to think through, what is it that I'm doing? Why am I doing it? What do I need to include? Just like any story you would tell. And so this is what he made for his project. And to him, he was like, okay, well, I'm going to make a Google slide presentation. Like, bud, this is the Google slides. What would your slides be? Those are going to be your components of the map. So he had an introduction, and then he had a little bit of an that he wrote about animals. He did know about habitats, and he was interested in habitats. So me and my GIS knowledge as a teacher would then say, well, there's some good animal habitats in New Hampshire through New Hampshire Fish and Game. And so he detailed the way that he went about making the story map. And he actually included 2 maps in here. One is he went to iNaturalist. We took some information with the iNaturalist in the field, and then he went to iNaturalist and downloaded all of the data from Stratham, which you could do. And the fun thing about this is that his class in 4th grade did a BioBlitz project in Stratham Hill Park, which is inside of Stratham. So some of the data that he was using in this map were actually data he collected with his class when he was in 4th grade. And so this map, he decided to break it down. It was a discussion, well, what do you want to show? Not just everywhere, but what types of things? So he broke it down into these categories. He thought it would be good to show some of the town boundaries so that people knew where it was. And for each of these, then when you click on a point, a little pop-up bubble appears, and he decided what he wanted in it. He wanted the general name, when it was observed, the scientific name, and then the picture. So this, as you can see, is an interactive live map. And this is based on the data from iNaturalist that was in Stratham. I wanted to then get him to think, well, what else? In addition to the animals, he already had habitats in the back of his map. So he grabbed some with, this is the one part where he needed some help in the GIS part of it. And he built this map using this New Hampshire Wildlife Action Plan data, which is a statewide data layer that shows different types of rank of habitat. And so he wanted different colors representing different types, and he still wanted the certain types. He wanted really to look at animals in this case. And so that information is still the same. When you click, you get the information about the critters. As you zoom in, again, this is an interactive map where you can browse around and look. And then the final thing that he did was choose his top 10 sightings that he found. Now, whether or not these were all actually cited in New Hampshire, according to iNaturalist, they were seen in Stratham. And so he used this slideshow to then pull out the 10 that he thought were the most interesting out of those that he found by looking through his maps. So did this take him 400 hours? No. Is it like using all the tools potentially in StoryMaps? No, but he did. I was impressed that the idea that he went through, he thought about it, and the StoryMap tool allowed him to take the way that he did things, the way he was thinking about things, and then present that information out to people in a format that he was then able to just give his teacher a link. He also wrote up a little summary of what he did to hand in the assignment and had the link in there with his teacher. So I was happy that he finally wanted to make a story map and made one, but this was driven by his interests and also was something that was done completely by him, with the one exception, which was to take that iNaturalist data. I did help him get it off of iNaturalist and put it to a place where he could add it to his map. But aside from that, everything was done by him with a little bit of guidance from me, just using iNaturalist and the StoryMap interface. So I'm a bit proud is why I'm showing it, but it's also a specific tangible example of somebody, a student who saw this as something useful, didn't really have a ton of background in it, and sort of was guided through thinking through how this could be used for a specific goal that they had in mind, which I think is really a key of thinking about how technology can be used in order to aid education and expression. So, right, I'm going to stop. So it was plenty of time of me talking. I just wanted to then pause and see what people had for questions, thoughts, ideas before I showed a little bit of the behind the scenes clicking so you can get an idea of what it looks like when you build story maps. Any questions?
So, I mean, I guess you answered my question. So I was actually curious when I saw the presentation to think about the idea of doing it without mapping. So I was kicking around, we're doing the trout in the classroom. And so like a lot of what we're doing is in the classroom, but I was thinking about with those overlays, we could like look at stages and then probably eventually talk about where we're releasing them, but that could be like a nice chronicling tool. So I love that piece.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, well, it's interesting because I got a little behind the scenes tour of this before it came out. And the older version of story maps, there were some that you could use with no maps, but they really, and I told people in our workshops, well, what's the difference between using a story map to do what you're talking about and creating a website? Maybe there's none, but do you have a website creation tool that will let you build this sort of website with these interactive elements that you can do basically by getting a free account without a lot of background in web coding? And the answer for most people is no. So that was part of their pitch, is they thought, yeah, you have a story to tell, even though it doesn't have any maps, but you want this cool, dynamic, interactive, fairly easy to use web creation tool, go for it. So be it. There's no maps. The other thing that's interesting is I've had some people in extension make story maps with no maps. Then the question is, once you do that, hey, maybe there are maps that you could use eventually, or you might then think, all right, I make this point here about the trout, but then why are trout, like where are trout found? Or we didn't do that in the classroom, but maybe I can find a map to add to that story later or next year, or who knows. So I think it's fine. I even had a webinar a few years ago called Story Maps Without Maps, and had an example of a woman who used it in Oregon State University to talk about her seed to table program that she did. And there wasn't a single map in there, and still she found it a useful tool. So thank you for that.
And Shane, if I may add something to that, Emily, you sure can do it without maps. I find the spatial location, though, helpful, because part of the story is, where is something living? Where is it from? Where is the watershed? So you certainly absolutely can just do the life cycle and things like that. Think about, though, making some spatial context to it, especially with that first story map we saw with the archaeological dig. Just the pictures of what they found was fascinating to me. It was even more fascinating to find out where they were and where else they were found to sort of complete the story. So you absolutely can without the maps. It just adds to it, depending on what story you're trying to tell. So.
Well, and the thing about that story map was interesting is that she didn't want to show where the dig sites were. Like very specifically, they don't want people to know where they are. So I said, well, you have some cool mapping capabilities. What kind of maps do you want to add to this? And she said, well, really don't want people to know where, but why don't we think about the impact of, well, where did all these things come from? And we just did it based on either the country, or sometimes the pottery was so specific they knew a city. And she's like, well, that's fine. And just put a dot near Great Bay. That makes the point. It uses the maps, but it doesn't reveal things that we don't want to reveal as part of, we don't want to make it too easy for people to find out where these dig sites are. So, okay, any other questions before I do a little behind the scenes, just for you to see what it looks like?
I'm going to give like a little advance notice, but as he's building this story map, there are maps available to you that are curated content called the Living Atlas. So you don't even have to make a map. You could steal someone else's map and, if you made maybe a story map of maps of interesting things you want your students to look at. So Shane will show you where those are.
Yeah, and that's one of the cool things I think about Arcgis Online is so many people can share maps that a whole bunch of things already exist that might be useful. I mean, part of the challenge is finding out of the sea of things that might exist, do things exist that are useful to you, right? And then that's always that first step, but
That's the rabbit hole, but yeah.
well, and it's part of what we hope to be able to help people with over time is finding places that have that information that they're looking for. And also if we find things that are useful for one class, being able to share them with others or other schools too, right? All right, so let me just grab this other window and bring it down here. All right, so this again is just so you can see the basics. I'm not going to go through every option. We don't have enough time and that would be super boring anyway. But when you get into the StoryMaps interface and you log in with your account, as you can see, things are pretty well, they're not overly confusing. There's even this new story tab or button that's here. I will say they try to help you in a lot of ways. And often as you roll over these items, they even have these little pop-ups that try to give you some information. We're going to start from scratch, but if you already know that you want some of these specific types, you can go ahead and choose one of those. I'm not going to do that because I want to show more options, but and again, you can have these little things sort of appear to try to give you information. There's also help throughout, but the key thing is that there's these plus buttons throughout that lets you add content as you build your map. And so just so you can see before I add anything, they even categorize them basic. So you can put in text, buttons and separators, which is the writing or the headings you're going to do. They have other elements like map, image. You saw the image gallery in that other one if you had a series of images, video, audio, embed, which means that if you have another website you'd like to embed inside the story map or something else that gives you an embed code, like Tableau, for example, is a type of map or tool that people use. Well, Tableau gives you an embed code, so you can add it there. And then swipe and then timeline. So these are maybe a little more advanced elements to add in. And then they have their sections, which are called immersive. So those are like the slideshow, the sidecar, and the map tour, where once you add that element in, you're going to have to build it, right? You're going to have to add your slides or add your points on the map. So I'm going to add just a few things quickly just to show you in general what they look like. This is the greatest. Most of these, when you add something in and you highlight it, you have these little bars that appear on the side. One point I'll make about the text, which is very different than the previous version, is they have this idea of styling. In the other version, you had to handcraft individually every single text element to look the way you wanted. This, they have some of these pre-configured. So you want it to be big and blocky, you can choose heading. You want it to be maybe not quite so big, but still blocky, you can choose subheading. If you want it to maybe stand out a little bit, you can choose this quote formatting. So they have all these pre-configured formats that help you to break up the flow. Because I think sometimes when you have tons of text, it can get just overwhelming. And there's a lot of evidence that people read very differently on a screen than they do on a piece of paper. I'll say, if you notice as I move around the cursor, these little plus buttons, plus icons appear. If you wanted to add something above it or below it, you click on the plus and it brings up that same menu that allows you to add more information. So just add a separator, for example. And I don't know which one of these people want me to try. Often they'll work very similarly, but let me just add an image in here. You can see there's most of these, you have an option to upload images or to use a link. I will just say, if you use a link, keep in mind that links can change over time. So if you are just going to use a link to something, you should probably make sure that it's something that's not going to move. And let me just get an link, copy image link. Just like the text, when you highlight it and hover over it, other tools appear. This one too, when you hover over it, other options appear. You can move it to different sides of the screen and you can have different sizes that you want. Notice there's one that's even bigger. The reason that one doesn't work is because there's not, StoryMaps knows that if I did it full screen, it would look junky because the image isn't very detailed. So it does allow you to move around after you've added and configure the way things look. Again, there's a little plus buttons above and below. And videos, audios, images, they're very similar. You either upload it or you embed it. An image gallery, you just take a whole bunch of images and upload it and it'll create the gallery. The timeline I wanted to mention just because I wanted to show you that I chose this option for the way that it looked, but there's actually a couple different options here. And this was just a choice that Megan preferred this version to these two. But I do want to point out maybe one of the things that's most important if you really want to have maps is how do you add a map? And when you click add new map, one of the things that Rebecca said is you don't have to create your own maps. There's tons of maps other people have made, and that's through this thing called the Living Atlas. So that is a whole bunch of maps people from around the world have made and published. You can search for different things. Esri put them into a couple of different categories, but if I wanted to add a map on wildfire, let's see what happens. And I just search wildfire. So here's different maps that were created by different people. You can see who created them and have an idea of when they were last edited and the information. So I'll just add this one into my map, into my story map. And so these are wildfire locations throughout the country. This one's a bit complicated because there's a whole bunch of different types of layers that are in the map, and you can choose to hide or show different layers. But I'm just going to add that in. So here's a map of wildfires across the country. Same way you can have different sizes, elements. This one, you can even have it be full screen. So you can have it so that the whole screen is basically taken over by a map for you to use. If you want to make your own map to add, one thing you can do is use Arcgis Online, which is the background of it. But even if you don't, and this is one of the cool things, you can make an express map. And this was very intentional of them to say, even if you don't have GIS, we still want you to be able to add maps. And it even has this little dialogue that leads you through. How do you make it? Start drawing using these tools and add finishing touches. So they have these little tools right here that you can just sketch right on the map. So if you have this point that you think is interesting, or if you wanted to use numbered points, if you click a point on the map, it lets you add an image, a name, or a description, and even choose the type of style or color that you want. So you could add an area that you wanted to define. I don't know what that means, but it could be another feature that's on your map. So with even out knowing anything about the fancier part, you can go ahead and build a map that you can also add into your screen. And again, the difference between just making a, tracing on something and drawing using this mapping tool is that it is an interactive map that people can explore and update over time. So this is not the greatest story map in the history of the world, but it does sort of, as you're building, give you at least some sort of ideas about different elements that you can add. One final thing to mention here is these more immersive sections. So these top ones, the text you add, you configure a little bit, you're sort of done. The media takes, whether it's the map, could be probably the most complicated, but image, video, audio, you're basically saying, I want to put a video, here's the link to it, it's this size. The immersive sections are funny. These used to be their own story maps in the old version. They're basically letting you take an old story map and shove it inside of one of the new ones. They all work largely the same, and they all have these little, again, help diagrams to sort of lead you through. But the way that this works is that you build one slide at a time. So if you put the title, so you could say, this is a map I want people to see. And you can see you can add an image, a video, or a map. And then when you're ready for your next one, you just click on new slide and you get another one that you can create. So you're just hand building them in the same way you'd build almost any other presentation, one at a time in different sections, with then the result being that it is an interactive element inside of your story map that you could let people flip through and experience. But there's definitely no specific technology that's needed other than knowing what you want to put and knowing where your media are that you want to upload into this or link to. When you are done, you can publish these story maps, but also notice that you have different options. You can make it so that everybody in the world can see it, or you can make it so only I can see it, or you can make it that everybody who has a login in my organization. So let's say your school had an account and you had all your teachers had a login, or even 3 teachers, however many teachers had a login, they could all see it. The other thing that you can do if you have an account at your school is you can have groups. And this is really no different than a lot of other cloud technologies, but you could say, no, I don't want everybody in the school to see it. I have my classroom, all the kids have accounts and they're all in a group. So I only want the kids in my classroom to see it. Or let's say all the 4th grade teachers can see it, but nobody else can see it. So there's lots of ways that you can restrict it, which I think can be important, especially in any use of mapping, but probably especially within a school context, it can be important really to control that. So there's lots of levels of control over that. And to preview my map, which again is not great nor done, you then have all of those elements that you can scroll down and interact with all of them. And so remember, some of these maps you build yourself, some of them you can grab from other people. And one thing that's the most important is that before you start doing it, really, you need a story, or at least the idea of a story or a hope of a story that you're going to build. But notice also that you can look on different size devices. I always do that by changing the size of my browser window, but it will simulate for you when you're previewing what it will look like on different size devices, which I think can be a useful reality check when you design something, then looking at it. Okay, so no is quick, pretty basic. Just want to say there are themes you can use. I find most of them very jarring to use. You can also create your own theme. So if you're somebody, or let's say your school wanted to have all of them look the same, or all the science ones look one way, all the history ones look another, there is the ability to change. Find many people don't change at all, but a bunch of people do choose, oh, I want mine to look a certain way. So that was very quick and dirty, but it was just supposed to give you a general idea of what it would look like from the technology side to build one. I think in the end, the more difficult part is not the technology. The more difficult part is what is your story and assembling your content in the first place. But I will say I've watched and worked with StoryMaps for a long time. This new version is much easier for people to use who have no experience in GIS. And for the people who do, it's certainly fine as well. If you're very map heavy and you want very specific maps, then some or more GIS knowledge is required. If you're mostly interested in content and putting some maps where they fit in, or even remember that map with the pottery, that had nothing to do with GIS. You could build this right in the interface. There's not, if that's how you are, there's really not much more you need to learn technology wise than just some of the basics of what you've seen. But I do realize that part of the get inspired, you at least have a clue. Then the question is, well, how could I use this? And where's the content? Where's the images? Or where's the text that I want to put down here? Where are those links? You may already have them assembled in another place. And then this is just the way that you wind up sort of composing them and putting them all together. But I will also say that story maps are not magic. Just because you can do it doesn't mean that you should always use a story map. And I've seen some really bad story maps. Just because the technology is cool doesn't mean that all uses of them are great. And it's very subjective what you think is bad or good. But I will say that story maps that I've found to be less effective are the ones that are incredibly text heavy, that don't have a lot of other elements within them. because then they just seem to me to be a blog post on a website that might be an effective use for their point, but I think falls short of maybe the interactiveness or taking advantage of the different ways that you can share and make it more of an experience of people interacting with it instead of just reading along. It's not to say that text is bad, but figuring how people would stay engaged and get information on a screen does take some thought, which is definitely different than if people are reading it in a book or on a piece of paper. So I stopped a little bit past the end of what I wanted to, but let me stop sharing, see if there's any questions. Okay.
Sarah asked about just showing where those pre-made maps were again, and they're called a living atlas. So if you go into the add map and select living atlas, that's
yeah. So
you can also just Google living atlas and kind of browse them that way.
Yeah, and living atlas is the maps that exist that Esri feels are good enough to include in the living atlas, right? So there's sort of a variety of different types of things. They're supposed to be a way to help people find reliable, potentially very useful maps for them to use in their story maps or other elements. I'd be fascinated to see the behind the scenes of how that list is maintained and curated and what gets in and what gets booted and why. But also if Esri has produced maps that they spend a lot of time with, I'm sure that they put them there as well. I will say that I have used 0 living atlas maps in my work, but that's just because it's not really aligned with what it is that I do. But there's lots of different maps and lots of different data layers that are out there. So the living atlas is definitely the place to start because it's their curated version of the things that are best. But just because something's not in the living atlas doesn't mean that it's worthless. It just means it didn't get their ultimate badge of approval.
You can start with living atlas as like USGS topos are in there and other base maps are in there. So if you want to use them as a starting point, they're good for that.
Yep.
I'm going to take this pause to just put, before people start popping off, to put in the plug for the New Hampshire Student Map Competition, which is sponsored by Esri, which is the software company that creates Storymaps and Arcgis Online. If you and your students, it's for grades 4 through 12. If your student creates a story map, it doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to basically be original content and include some original data, whatever that might look like. It could just be a table of data that they put on the map, or they went out and did a bio blitz. If they make a story map, you can submit it to the competition, and there's a link in the chat of how to learn more about the competition, including a little 60-second video that I won't try to play because it doesn't work well on my screen.
That was one of the funniest things. She had 2 videos playing simultaneously last time, but she couldn't hear it, so she didn't know that they both were playing. It was really funny. That was pretty impressive. I don't even know that you could do that again if you tried, Rebecca. That was great.
And then I'm going to share another link of a story. It's basically a story map about story maps that is in the resources, but I thought it was cool. It's called the Anatomy of a Story, and it kind of just walks you through all what all the things are called, because sometimes you get lost. Like, is this the header? Is this the cover? There's just a lot of jargony words, and it kind of just walks through what all those things are called in a story map. So, little refresher of what Shane showed you.
Okay, so are there any specific questions or any worries? Like, what is the thing other than time that you think is going to be maybe the biggest stumbling block for the idea of taking maybe inspiration into tangible use of this? Because one of the things that there's a series of us that have been trying over many years, and I saw Ina's on, so I don't know if we want to give Ina a chance to say hi officially to people, but is trying to figure out what is it that we can do to help all of you get your head around how you might use this and use it in the classroom. Part of it is just knowing it exists, right? And then getting inspiration because you saw some examples in a little bit of behind the scenes. We know there are other steps like getting an account or finding the right data or understanding the best way to use it. And we have been dormant-ish, I guess, for a few years, but we're really looking to have more trainings and office hours and different things that would help people. And as Rebecca's stating, we are going to start having some office hours, which is basically just for an hour and a half every few weeks, just have an open mic on Zoom for people who want to do whatever. They want to have help, they want to ask questions, they want to just talk with other people who are interested. We will have little, maybe tiny presentations, but they would happen maybe on the half hour. And the idea is just to have it be open for people to join and ask questions. We picked 3 to 4:30 because we figured depending on when people's school get out, they could make some of that. But the idea was not supposed to be necessarily that people would come for an hour and a half of office hours. We just wanted to think of a way to get people a chance to get questions answered. And I would just say as one parting thought, at least in the presentation part, that I feel pretty confident in saying this. You will never feel that you're an expert in this. And that should not be a bar for you to think is achievable before you can use it. Because I have been working with GIS since, actually the first class I ever was involved in helping to teach, Ina took. What was that, in 2000? And I still feel like I'm learning things all the time. Oh, you're muted, Ina. And I still feel like I'm learning things all the time. So that's not to scare people. It's just to think that think about what you can do with it, as opposed to maybe being overwhelmed by everything that you could potentially do with it. And so Ina, did you want to just say anything quickly before we transition to this other phase of the workshop?
Hi, everybody. Great to see so many people here. Shane, I think that was in 1999.
Was it?
That we did that, or 2001. I did it a couple of times. So it was a few years ago, and great to see so many people here. Again, special thanks to you and Rebecca for getting things moving again. I'm seeing some people here. Russ, who was one of our first recruits back 99, 2000, and did done some GIS stuff. So it's nice to see some people here again I haven't seen in a while, and looking forward to seeing some great student work.
Okay.
I feel like my students would just love to just dive in and just try it out. You know, they're not afraid to mess it up and get in there and get their fingers all wrinkly. I can see though them being like getting in too deep and then not. So I think the planning stage is really going to be important. So, you know, what is it that you're going to, what do you think you're going to be doing as we work through this before you just jump in and kind of wing it? So I think that would maybe be the biggest barrier for my students, is having a plan before they get in too deep.
100%. In fact, and I can't find it. I showed it last time. So one of the things I made Charlie do was sit down with a big piece of paper and plan out his ideas. And I even talked through different, well, what do you think of this? Or how would that work? And I've done that myself. One of the few story maps I worked on with folks in Extension, they were all excited. They had a computer hooked up to a laptop, and I dramatically walked in the room and I shut the laptop. And I said, what's our story? Like, what is it that we're going to do? And I think you've hit in a very key element, that the clicking and the technology part is one section of it, but the planning and the consideration can happen when you're clicking, but should really happen before it is that you start clicking, which would also make it not just people on a computer, right? So part of the building of it and the creation and the sharing is on the computer, but there's lots of work that happens that's not necessarily just editing the story map. And I guess I would also make a pitch too, that there could also be that's a way to get different students involved in different ways. Like everybody could make their own story map, but also if you had a group, you would know best if it's good or bad to have all of them building their own story maps or all of them editing it. But even if people weren't that interested in creating the story map itself, doing the editing, there are other roles and other ways that people could work together on that are not just the clicking in the screen. So